Assalamualaikum, hi viewers. Welcome to my channel Learning with Khatak. Today we are going to start a very important series of lectures that is neural networks. Basically, what is neural networks and to discuss the structure of neural networks, why it is called a neural networks, its origin, how it's working, and so on. So multiple concepts will be discussed graphically, conceptually in the coming couple of lectures. So if you look at this neural networks, and we also call it artificial neural networks, why we call it artificial neural networks, and what is neural networks, why we call it a neural networks. Obviously we call it a neural networks because this is based on the neuron. Now what is neuron is, we know that a human brain is made of billions of neurons. They are interconnected with each other to transmit the information, the inputs, to communicate with each other. So that's why it is called neural because this is based upon the neurons, and network means millions, billions of neurons are interconnected to communicate with each other. So when these neural networks means multiple neurons are interconnected, and if we done it in machine, then artificially, then this is concept is called artificial neural networks. So what does it mean? If we replicate the working structure, the working mechanism of a human brain inside a machine, then this is called artificial neural networks. So if you look at this brain structure into the machine, so obviously neural from the word neurons. Network means connected multiple neurons, so that's why it is, we call it a neural networks based upon the neurons of a human brain, and multiple neurons are interconnected with each other, and so based on the human neuron structure. So that's why we call it a neural networks. If you look at the brain structure of a human, just somehow look like this. Similarly, these are the artificial neural networks where multiple neurons are interconnected with each other, and so on. So this is the basic introduction of neural networks. Why we call it a neural networks? Because of the brain structures, is based upon the brain structure, and if we replicate the brain structure inside a machine artificially, then this is called artificial neural networks. Artificial neural networks. The term artificial neural networks refer to a biological inspired subfield of artificial intelligence modeled after the brain. As we discussed in the first slide, that artificial neural networks is basically based upon the structure of the brain. In artificial neural networks is usually computational networks. Obviously, different neurons are interconnected with each others to make a computational networks based on biological neural networks that construct the structure of the human brain. Similar to a human brain has neurons interconnected to each other, artificial neural networks also have a neurons that are linked to each other in various layers of the network. These neurons are also known as nodes. So in human brain biological structures, they are called neurons, while in the artificial neural networks, the neurons termed as a nodes. Similarly, to each other in various layers of the networks. In artificial neural networks, the different neurons will be discussed in the form of layers, and each neuron will be termed as a node in the network. So this is basically some about neural networks, its origin, um, from where it started. Algorithm they try to manage the brains, as we discussed earlier, was very widely used in 18, 19, etc. Recent resurgence, state of the art technologies for many applications. Basically, in this couple of series of lectures, we will dedicated one separate lecture to discuss the state of the art applications that are based upon the neural networks and artificial neural networks. But from here, why we covering this topic here? Because we have to jump on deep learning network deep learning. So basically neural networks provide base for the deep learning. from after these couple of lectures, we will start a new series for the deep learning. So that's why for the deep learning, neural networks provide the basics for. So basically, now we want to show that how a neurons look like inside the brain. This is a very rough sketch of the neurons inside the brain. So let it make more visible. So neuron in the brain. So if we consider this is a neuron, look at this. Let's suppose this is a neurons, but here in this case we have a sketch separately. So there are almost 3 or 4 parts in the human neurons that are mostly discussed. For example, first one is nucleus. This is the nucleus part. What nucleus done? Let me explain in the later slides. Similarly, this is a dendrites, dendrites, dendrites or dendrites. Some people call it. Dendrite or basically input wires. Input wire because from where we want to give some input, some information, some data to flow to the other neurons. So this is dendrites, these are the input wires, and this is the nucleus, and this is the axon output wire. So means from here we are going to input some things in the brain, some things are input in the brain, and from here after the processing in the nucleus, the inputs are become output here at the axons, and this is the cell body. Nucleus means this is in the cell body. Node of Renvier, these are the different nodes in the Renvier's is myelin health and axon terminal. This is basically the terminal of the axon. So now this is basically 3 or 4 important parts in the neurons inside the brains. Now we will discuss these part with the artificial neural networks. If we want to develop neurons based on the human brain structures, but this neuron will be definitely artificial. So what will be the part of this artificial neurons? So again, neurons in the brain, these are different muscles, and these are the different parts. For example, electrical impulse and dendrites, these are the dendrites, and these are the axons, and these are the neurons, basically nucleus, node, etc. So this is biologically representations. US National Institute of Health, National Institute of this basically the sketch taken from Andrew Ng. So the neurons. Up now look at more clearly. Here is, this is the neurons, this is the nucleus, this is the axon, and this is the output of the axons, terminal of the axon. This is the input wired. Now let's compare it with the artificial neurons. Some important terms. Dendrite from biological neural networks represent inputs in artificial neural network. So keep in mind, dendroids represent inputs in the artificial neural network. Cell nucleus represent a nodes, a complete node, a complete neurons. Synapses represents weights. Some very important concepts we will discuss later on in this lectures. Weights, and axon represent output. So biological neural networks, dendrites, while in artificial neural networks we call it inputs. Dendroids will be termed as input, cell nucleus, node, synapses, weights, and axon output. So in artificial neural networks, these are the important terms we will use: inputs, nodes, weights, and output. How the input will be interpreted, nodes, weights, and output, let's see and start. So the neurons, these are the dendrites, these are the neurons, basically nucleus or cell, and this is the axons. So something will be input from here, are dendrites or the inputs. Basically different types of signals are input with the help of dendrites, and these inputs are come to the neurons or the cell parts after performing necessary operations, processings These are transmitted via the axons, output through the axons to some other neurons, and so on. Artificial neural networks primarily consist of three layers. What are these three layers? These are the input layers, this is the hidden layers 1, and this is hidden layers 2, and this is the output layers. So this is not this is very important concepts, that this is the input layer means dendrites, this is the axon, and these are the hidden layers. Now how many inputs layer will be theirs? It depends upon the application, it depends upon the problem. There may be multiple hidden layers to process efficiently the inputs received from the dendrites and to produce is a output. So there may be a multiples hidden layers inside the artificial neural networks. So what are the tasks of input layer, hidden layer, and output layer? Input layer, is the name suggests, it accepts input in several different forms provided by the programmer. So the input may be in form of text, the input may be in form of categorical values, or are in different forms. Hidden layers, the hidden layers represent in between input and output layer. It performs all the calculations to find hidden features and patterns, because for examples, if we provide some inputs in form of text, the role of the working of the hidden layers, the basic purpose of the hidden layers, to extract some patterns, some features, some hidden, apply some feature engineering rules on the input layer. The data comes from the input layer and then proceed to the output layers. The output layers, the input goes through a series of transformation using the hidden layers, which finally result in output that is conveyed using this layer. Obviously, after the performing necessary operations inside the hidden layers, the informations or the data is flows to the output layer. The artificial neural networks take input and computes the weight sum of the input and include a bias. This computation is represented in the form of transfer function. So if you look at this, this is basically a transfer function. That is, we use a sigmoid functions. I start from 1 to n. W is basically the weights, plus x is basically the neurons, and b is the look at this is the bias. So let me discuss, we will discuss this weight, from where we can get the weights, what is the x and b. It determines weight total is passed as input to an activation functions to produce the output. Activation function chooses whether a node should fire or not. Only those who are fired make it to the output layer. There are distinctive activations function available that can be applied upon the sort of task we are performing. So what is activation functions, how activation function will work will be covered later on this lecture. So basically this is the activation functions. There may be a different activation functions, and how these activation functions works, how weight will be calculated, how from where the weights will come, and what is the xi and what is the b. Let's discuss it. So if this is a neurons, we call it a node. These are the input signal 1, input signal 2, input signal m. So there may be a multiple signals, and this is the output signals. Basically input value 1, input value 2, input value m. Multiple inputs are coming to this neurons. X1, x2, xm are basically the features, the data that will be provided as input to this structure. And this is the synapses, means these are the different weights assigned by the through some mechanism. If you look at this, input value 1 independent variable, independent variable 2, independent variable m. So if you have experienced a data sets, in data sets there are two parts basically. One is independent variable and other one is the dependent variable. Independent variable are also called the features, while the dependent variable are called the target labels or the class label. So basically these input values are the independent variables or the features value. These are the different data that will be passed to this neurons. Okay, then standardize means make it some standard input variable 1, input variable 2, input variable m. Different variables are input here. Now this is the output value. Okay, so if, what does it mean? If this is the input variable, the value of input variable, or this is the feature 1, feature 2, feature 3. For feature 1, feature 2, features 3, these feature 1, feature 2 are forwarded to the neurons, to the hidden layers. After extracting the features of processing necessary informations, uh, this will be y is the output value for these input values variables. For example, if I say that this is 1, 2, 3, these are the 3 features. For these 3 features, if the values are 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, then for these input value, the output value or the class label will be y. So how this y, where is the weight? Now look at this. Can be. Now one thing, one important thing should be noted, that the output value may be a continuous, price, or categorical. Binary will exist, yes or no, categorical. For example, if these are the inputs value, let's examples will be there after. If a binary means, for example, let's, there are two values, male or female, is the input features forwarded to the neurons. Obviously based upon the calculations, it will give us either it is a male or female. Similarly, if these two values are the one features represent either the customer will buy, and the features 2 whether the customer will not buy. So these two values, two features data are forwarded to the neurons. So based upon the previous history, the output value will be either the customer will buy or not. Okay, so output value 1, output value 2, output value p. So what does it mean now? 3 features, 3 data, and multiple output values, output value 1, output value 2, and output value p. Multiple output value will be there. Now again, input value m, neurons, and output value, the one output value will be selected. So single observation, same observation, single observation. So this is if a single observation, and this is the single observation. Now the output value again. Now here the weight will be calculated. Here different weight will be assigned. How different will be assigned? W1, W2, and Wm. Now W1 is assigned to input value 1, means feature 1, W2 to feature 2, and Wm to feature 3. And then this is basically the activation functions. This activation function will calculate the final value for the feature 1, feature 2, feature 3 based upon the weight plus the bias, as we discussed previous in this lecture. So first step, I is equal to 1 to m, means these are the features representing features 1, features 2 up to features m. Sum up the different features, all the features, and then yx xi. Yi is the weight of I means weight, and x is the node, basically input you value 1, feature 1, input 1, node 1. So first step, what we did in the first step, that sum up all the weights of all the features provided as a input, and then we applied a functions, that is theta functions or pi functions. In a second step, yes, we just do that, that apply a function. Now what is this functions? What is the role of these functions will be discussed in the next lecture. Basically this is the activation functions, how this activation functions basically work, what is the basics of the activation functions, how different activation functions will be used inside the artificial neural networks will be discussed in the later on. So in this lectures what we have discussed, that artificial neural networks is based upon the brain structure of the neurons. And we look at the brain structure of the neurons, that there are 3 4 important parts in the neurons of a brain structures, and how these 3 or 4 parts are replicated inside the artificial neural networks. And then we discuss some um, these different of parts with respect to brain structure, and then we discuss like here that how inputs are forwarded to the input layers. Then what is the task of hidden layers? In hidden layers, basically we just discussed of functions, name activation functions, how this activation functions will perform, we'll discuss and later on. So thank you very much, guys, and wait for the next lecture.